Welcome to our webinar, Fatigue, the Next Frontier in Workplace Safety and Wellness. My name is Kevin Lombardo. I am the President and CEO of DORN Companies. We are a trusted injury prevention partner to over 50 companies in the U.S. We have been preventing musculoskeletal and ergonomic-related injuries for over 20 years. Today, we have some amazing fatigue thought leaders on our panel. Mike Harnett. Mike is the President of Solaris Fatigue Management. Mike has over 25 years of experience consulting with various U.S. and Canadian government agencies, including NASA, the Federal Rail Association, and the Rail Association of Canada. She has also assisted in the delivery of program development and guidance documents for the nuclear, airline, mining, energy, municipality, first responder, and entertainment industries. Dr. Lora Cavuoto. Lora is an associate professor of industrial and systems engineering at the University at Buffalo, where she directs the ergonomics and biomechanics lab. Her current research interests include quantifying physical exposures and psychological responses in the workplace to identify indicators of fatigue development, to understand and model the effects of health conditions, particularly obesity and aging, on physical capacity, specifically strength, fatigue, and motor performance. She is currently a scientific editor for Applied Ergonomics and an associate editor of Human Factors and Ergonomics in Manufacturing and Service Industries. Dr. Cassie Hilditch. Dr. Hilditch works as a research scientist with the Fatigue Countermeasures Lab at NASA Ames Research Center in California. Cassie's previous research positions include Harvard Medical School and Brown University here in the U.S. and the University of South Australia. Cassie's expertise relates to sleep, fatigue, performance, countermeasures, and safety in shift work context. Today's webinar is all about fatigue in the workplace. Mike, Lora, Cassie, and I will cover the following topics. First, we'll look at the current situations. Mike and I will address different types of fatigue and look at several operational examples. Lora will present a soon-to-be-published research paper that she's been working on with the University at Buffalo, and Cassie will present several case studies that she's worked on as a senior researcher at NASA. We will finish our webinar with top recommendations on how to deal with workplace fatigue. We will give you strategies that you can implement today. Before we jump into the research and case studies, let's take a moment to look at the current situation. More than 2/3 of employees are tired at work, increasing the risk of injuries and incidents on the job. This according to the National Safety Council. Sleep disorders and chronic fatigue are hidden costs that affect employers across the U.S. 90% of America's employers have been negatively impacted by tired employees. Fatigue is currently costing us over $400 billion a year. The root cause of fatigue is a hidden issue, and very few organizations are measuring it. Still, many of us don't believe that fatigue is a real issue. Some say that fatigue is laziness. You will hear some shift workers say they can catch up on sleep after working a 12-hour shift. They can do it at a different time. And others, I've been working 18 straight hours before. I'm fine. Don't worry about me. In reality, fatigue costs anywhere from $1,200 to $3,100 per employee per year in the U.S., according to studies. A company with 1,000 employees can lose more than $1.4 million per year in costs associated with absenteeism, diminished productivity, and healthcare costs. About 1/3 of all employers report employees' injuries and near misses due to worker fatigue. Have said they have had employees fall asleep on the job. Let's look at some recent data from Sleep Matters Initiative Fatigue Cost Calculator. A New York construction company with 200 workers could lose $315,000 a year, including $61,000 from just absenteeism alone. The trucking industry found that a driver with chronic fatigue-related disease can accumulate an average of $6,000 a year in medical costs alone. An average Fortune 500 company could save nearly $40 million a year if half of its workforce engaged in sleep health programs. These numbers are staggering, and when you look at the costs associated with the resulting injuries, presenteeism, and lost productivity, this cost could easily be nearing $1 trillion per year. Fatigue is a workplace hazard as it affects the ability to think clearly and respond appropriately, and as such has been linked to workplace injuries. 13% of all workplace injuries can be attributed to fatigue in some manner. Let's look at the physical aspect of this. Factors like heavy physical work, frequent lifting and repetitive movements, fixed or constrained body positions. Our bodies were not meant to be stationary, and when you look at most jobs in the U.S. economy, be it office or factory, people are stationary for many, many hours a day, pushing and pulling, poor rest and recovery, Athletes have multiple days to recover from a physically grueling game. Workers have less than 24 hours. We can't change that, but we have to figure out how to change the way we address it. The pace of the work, poor work practices and ergonomics, and prolonged work hours and irregular shifts. All of these can lead to physical and mental fatigue and occupational injuries. For example, airport baggage handlers lift an average of 5 to 10 bags every minute. Nursing assistants lift patients and residents every day and experience back-related musculoskeletal disorders of one of the highest rate in the industry. 69% of warehouse workers suffer from repetitive strain, and 70% of construction workers feel tired all the time. And we can go into any industry and find statistics like this. All this physical work sooner or later will have an impact on injury rates. OSHA states that workers are 37% more likely to sustain an injury when working 12-hour days. A 12-hour day with minimal recovery time will lead to worker fatigue and ultimately an injury. On top of it, our workforce is aging at a rapid pace, and the cost of musculoskeletal disorders has spiked in recent years, now putting a big burden on U.S. businesses and the GDP. It is known that in the last 5 years, musculoskeletal injuries as a percent of GDP has nearly doubled. And to make it worse, overexertions, strains, and sprains are affecting every organization and driving up costs. So why now? Why is this all of a sudden becoming a major topic throughout the U.S. in both academia and in organizations? The world around us is just changing. We live in a 24/7 world. We check our emails at night and on the weekends, psychosocial stresses, alcohol consumption, lack of physical activity, excessive electronic media use, among others. We don't get enough rest. We have poor diets and exercise habits. Sleep-related disorders are on the rise. Sleep loss possibly, as well as outdated working conditions. Not enough recovery and rest. So fatigue, it accumulates over time and becomes a chronic disease like any other disease that can lead to serious injuries and accidents. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mike to talk about sleep-related fatigue. Mike?
Well, thank you, Kevin. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take things a little bit of a different direction. Kevin was addressing a lot of the physical aspects of fatigue. And what I want to do is dive into the sleep-related aspect now, because generally speaking, when we're done at the end of the day, whether it's physical exertion or cognitive exertion, ideally, if our jobs are well designed, what's going to happen is we're going to go home at the end of the day, we're going to go to bed, and we're going to get some sleep. And that sleep should, in fact, prepare us for the next day. Now, we're going to have a problem if we don't get adequate restorative sleep. And that's what's going to result in decreased capacity throughout the next day in terms of us being able to perform mentally or physically. So it really comes down to, are we getting the restorative sleep that we need to counteract the efforts we did the day before? So if we don't get enough sleep, then what's going to happen is we're going to have fatigue that continues to accumulate. It's going to build and build and build. And there's nothing you can do about it except get sleep. Sleep is the only thing that cures fatigue. You cannot Starbuck it away. You certainly cannot Red Bull it away. Those will not eliminate the fatigue that is building in your body. And the thing is, if we don't address that sleep issue, we're going to see it manifest into short and long-term effects in terms of our physical health, our mental health, and even our emotional status. So if we look at it from a drowsiness perspective, this is a little bit different. Drowsiness is not the same as fatigue. Drowsiness is that feeling of sleepiness, that overwhelming feeling often, that's usually accompanied by a lack of energy. Now, drowsiness, unlike fatigue, drowsiness is something that fluctuates throughout the day, and we can temporarily mask drowsiness. So here's where a cup of coffee can help us out, or an engaging conversation. Those things can help mask the drowsiness temporarily. But the reality is, if you have any sleep debt built up in you, you have fatigue that keeps on building. And that fatigue, the more fatigue you have, the more intense and the more frequent those drowsy episodes are going to be. Now, the consequences of that is that we're going to see drowsiness affect us in a real-time aspect. So if you have a drowsy episode and you are operating a piece of equipment, or you're behind the wheel of something, or you're doing a safety-sensitive task, here's where drowsiness can lead towards a tragic outcome. So we need to really understand a little bit of the science behind the cognitive side of fatigue. So I just want to introduce the sleep-wake cycle. And really what this comes down to is we have two things going on in our body, what we call gene expressions that are driving our need for sleep. The first is what we call the homeostasis sleep drive. And very simply put, what this means is the longer we're awake, the more waste products build up in our brain and the tireder we become. And we know that generally speaking, once we get to around being awake for 16 or 17 hours of just straight wakefulness, we're going to start feeling overwhelming feelings of sleepiness and this desire to go to bed. At the same time, we have the circadian drive, and the circadian drive is all about our exposure to light, and in particular, sunlight being the most positive drive we have. And what that does is it makes us more alert as the sun goes up higher in the sky. Functionally, we can perform better. Cognitively, we're more aware of everything, and everything works out great until the sun goes down in the sky. And then at that point, combined with our homeostasis sleep drive, we end up going to bed. Now, all this means is that we are a 24-hour diurnal species. What that actually means is that every day we have light exposure throughout the course of the rotation of the planet. And depending on the amount of light exposure we get, that light is going to filter in through our eyes and go back to this portion of our brain called the master clock, or our suprachiasmatic nucleus. The master clock is in charge of controlling all of our rhythms in our peripheral clocks. So we have clocks throughout our body and in our different tissues, our organs, and the brain will try to harmonize all of its direction with these peripheral clocks so that everything is working in harmony. It'll tell things like, okay, pancreas, I need you to release insulin. Okay, kidneys, I need you to shut down now because we're trying to go to sleep here. So all of these rhythms have to work in harmony with each other for us to stay in a healthy state. But if we have light exposure at the wrong time or too much light exposure at the wrong time, it can desynchronize a lot of these rhythms. Now, one of the ways that we can also help keep these rhythms in check is by making sure we have a lot of routine in our lives. So routine comes in the form of what we call our exogenous factors. In other words, when you have light exposure, when you eat, when you go to bed, when you exercise, when you socialize, the more consistent our daily routines are, the stronger the harmony between these rhythms and the stronger the link between them so that they will not go through this jet lag effect. All right. So the reality of our species when it comes to understanding cognitive fatigue, and especially as it relates to shift work, is that we are a day-oriented species. That means we will always do our best quality of work during the bright daytime hours, and we will always get our best quality and quantity of recuperative sleep during the deepest, darkest nighttime hours. In other words, the reality of our species is we are not nocturnal, which means we cannot change your gene species and we cannot adapt to night shift. In fact, the most recent literature out there is stating that less than 3% of those who work on even a permanent night shift schedule will ever see any kind of significant adaptation. So that's not a lot of people. And on top of that, if we think we're adapted, because a lot of people think they have adapted to night shift, they've really just adapted to a state of impairment. And it's what we call a deviance of normal. So no, they haven't truly adapted to working night shift. They are just working at an impaired state. And the more consecutive night shifts we work, the harder it's going to be to synchronize. So sleep is certainly one of the issues that we're concerned about. And it's really a societal problem right now, not just a work problem. So, for example, we've got a couple of surveys that were done, and in Canada and the U.S., we found that approximately 3/4 of the population are not meeting the minimum requirements of 7 hours or more of sleep. Between 7 to 9 is what every adult typically needs. So we're seeing a huge impact on the amount of sleep that we're getting, and that is going to translate into all kinds of cognitive and performance impairments. So basically, when we continuously cut back on our sleep, which so many of us do for various reasons, one of the first things we're going to see is an impact on our ability to recognize the situation around us, to identify hazards in our immediate area. So that loss of situational awareness can play out in a very negative manner. We have a tendency to spend more time on task when we're tired. And that's not always a blessing. Sometimes it's a blessing because the brain will actually encourage us to take more time to make a right decision as opposed to making a quick wrong decision. But that's only going to be of benefit if time is on our side. If it's an emergency situation you're in, then you don't have the luxury of time. We also know that the more sleep deprived we are, the more we underestimate risk. And not only do we underestimate risk, but we have a greater tolerance for accepting risk. We know that our logic is flawed in terms of our decision-making capabilities or just recognizing how dangerous a situation may be. We have hindered visual perception. The eyes are dramatically affected when we're in a tired state, to the point that it can affect visual acuity, depth perception, and even hand-eye coordination. We know that there are problems with our problem-solving skills. We have slowed information processing, reduced reaction times, and even decreased learning abilities. These are only some of the impairments that have been noted scientifically. What we need to do is start to recognize how these impact us at the job site in terms of performance. I would assume that most jobs require one, two, or several of these different elements that are listed here. And this is what we have to start doing. We have to start connecting the dots between performance and fatigue. So, for example, some great research done on police officers. And when we compare tired officers to their performance capabilities, what they discovered is that the more tired they were, the more that the officers were going to rely on more aggressive forms of control and to use perhaps excessive force where it's not warranted. We also found that within the research, they were stating that the people who are going to court, the police officers, were being ill-prepared for court. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that they're putting in long hours, or maybe they're coming off of a night shift, and now they have to go and show up at court. And court doesn't care if they've only had 1 or 2 hours of sleep. You're scheduled for court, you have to be there. So they're often not prepared, and that, of course, has a big impact on our judicial system. And then we have recognition that there's a lot more errors on paperwork with cops that are tired. And that makes sense. I mean, the more tired we are, the more functional limitations we have, and especially if you're doing a lot of your paperwork at the end of your shift, which is very typical with police work. We also know that tired cops have a lot more citizen complaints issued against them. And again, because perhaps they're not as approachable, they have lower tolerance levels, and they just don't play as nice as we would hope they would. And on top of that, we see, again, that impairment with the eyes. The hand-eye coordination is dramatically affected with tired cops. And that's a little disturbing when you consider that they actually have weaponry in their hands. As another example, we can look at the medical schools, and a great study done at Harvard by Dr. Charles Eisler. And what he determined was that those interns who were scheduled for at least 24 consecutive hours, when they were looking at impacts on performance, they found that the odds of stabbing themselves with a needle stick or a scalpel increased by as much as 61%, which is a little disconcerting if your needle has just been stuck into somebody with some kind of disease that you don't want. They also found the risk of motor vehicle collisions on the drive home after these schedules increased by 168%, and a risk of a near miss increased 460%. Now, that near miss could be in a variety of situations. It could be while they're driving. It could be in the disbursement of medications, maybe the wrong dosage, or maybe the wrong medication entirely. So what these studies are showing us is that we have to start making that link between performance and fatigue, because in lieu of not making that distinction, then we have organizations that really don't understand if they have a fatigue problem, and they don't see the need for addressing fatigue. And it comes down to this: impaired is impaired. And this is research that dates back to 1997 with the primary study that really brought this to the forefront. And what the Australians were able to quantify was the amount of impairment if you compare fatigue impairment versus blood alcohol equivalency. And what they found is that if you're awake for just 17 hours, you are now at a blood alcohol equivalency of 0.05% impairment. And if you're awake for around 20 to 21 hours, you are reaching levels of 0.08 impairment. And if you get up to 24 hours, you are actually reaching 0.10. Now, once we start getting past 0.08 or up to 0.10, we're really looking at somewhere around the area of a 40% drop in alertness. So we really have to understand that we are operating in fatigue states when we have long work hours, or we're not getting the amount of sleep that we require before we return to work the next day. And I think this is one of the most important slides that I can show you. And this is a wonderful study that was done by Hans van Dongen. And what he was able to show is that he took 3 groups of people. One group was allowed 8 hours time in bed, one group was allowed 6 hours, and one group was allowed 4 hours. And they were kept on that sleep schedule for 14 days in a row. And using objective measures, what they call PVT, psychomotor vigilance testing, they would put them through these tests, and they discovered, and it makes sense, that by the 14th day in a row of being restricted in your sleep, we would see increases in errors, or what they call performance lapses. So much so that the group that only had 4 hours time in bed every night were up around the 17 mark. And those who had 6 hours time in bed were up around the 10, 11 mark. Now, what's interesting, at the same time that he did the objective study, he also did a subjective study, asking the participants to evaluate their own level of sleepiness and how they think they were performing. And these were their results, what they thought was going on. And if you look at the scale, the vertical scale on the left-hand side of both of these graphs, what you're going to notice is the one on the right only goes to 4 versus the one on the left that goes to 20. And what this tells us is that these participants all thought that by the second day of having their sleep restricted, that they had adjusted to that sleep schedule, and that nothing really changed for the remainder of those 14 days. And none of them scored higher than 2, or thought they scored higher than 2 errors when they were subjectively asked to give their opinions. So when we look at the actual objective data versus the subjective data, it's very, very clear. We will always overestimate our alertness and underestimate our sleepiness, simply because we're impaired at judging our own impairment. So what it comes down to is we need to figure out how to manage fatigue correctly. And that's going to be a combination of 2 things. It's a shared responsibility between the organization, who has to look at work schedules, workloads, and work environment, and the personal situation. The individual has to show up fit to work. That means they need to come well rested. They have to obtain the sleep that is afforded them. They have to manage their lifestyle, and they have to manage any health and medical disorders that could further impact their fatigue. So from here, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Lora Cavuoto, who's going to provide her own research in the areas of fatigue management.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to talk a bit about what we can do to try to address the issues of fatigue and what the body of research shows around fatigue interventions, particularly focused in manufacturing and warehousing industries. These industries present a unique opportunity to intervene in that we often have controlled work environments where we can implement set schedules. And we also have the case of workers across multiple shifts where we're going to need to address some of the physical challenges for a range of employees and shift schedules. So we want to think about what types of interventions are available. And if we think to our overall structure of safety interventions, we can think about our typical categorizations of interventions. The first level being administrative versus engineering controls, where with engineering controls, we're changing the task and how the task is performed. With administrative, we're changing more the structure of the work environment and the schedules and policies around the physical tasks that may be leading to fatigue. You can also think at the individual versus the workplace level. So are we putting in strategies for one person, or are we changing maybe the workstation or the work components to resolve the issues for multiple people at once? And then thinking in time scale, looking at being preventive, so minimizing the likelihood of fatigue developing, or reactive. Do we want interventions that are going to be implementable once someone has become fatigued? And I would recommend that we have interventions and those ready in the workplace to look at all of these levels. So have some things that are done to prevent fatigue, but then also have some solutions ready if fatigue does occur. And if we think of our typical safety hierarchy of controls, for most work tasks, it's difficult to be at the top level of eliminating the causes of fatigue, but this would be our ideal strategy. Instead, we're often down a few levels, looking at our engineering controls, our administrative controls, and then the personal protective approach. Now, if we think as with other safety interventions like hearing protection, we often say that engineering controls to be more effective long-term, personal protective, usually a necessary add-on component, but not a solution all unto their own. So if we think about the solution to physical fatigue, often have to think about it as a systems approach, within that hierarchy. So we might implement an engineering control of reorganizing or redesigning the work, where we reduce some of the physical fatigue risk factors like repetitive motions and excessive forces. Then we add in an administrative control of providing ergonomic consultations to workers so that they can have a workstation that works best for them. And also looking at the profile or demographics of the workforce to provide the employees with self-management strategies that they may be able to implement both at work and once they leave work for the day. So each of these on their own may not address the problem of physical fatigue, but together we can have a cohesive solution. So now we'll go into a few specific interventions in the literature or the research that's supporting these intervention types. And the first is at the individual level, looking at exercise and well-being. And the thought here is that if you have healthy individuals who are physically active, that they are more likely or less likely to develop fatigue, so more resistant to fatigue. But if we look across industries, as each of these bars is, we can see that in no industry do we really have more than half of the population meeting the exercise recommendations set out by the CDC, and then each is hovering around 40 to 50%. Now, the reason that this is important or maybe problematic if they're not getting the right level of exercise is that there's some support to show that in this case for a 6-week exercise trial where workers were exercising at least 3 days per week, the overall fatigue ratings on a subjective scale were less. And so workers reported feeling better after they participated in this exercise program. Now, in addition to general activity and motion, there's also the thought of adding some variability or activity into the work task performance as well. Because if we maintain a sedentary or a static position throughout the day, that can lead to discomfort developing and muscle fatigue across certain different parts of the body. And so in this study shown in this graph, for those who added in short periods of standing and activity over the course of the day, they also reported lower levels of total fatigue, whereas those who were sedentary for the full day had these higher total fatigue scores. So prolonged standing, we know, can lead to leg discomfort after just about 45 minutes of standing or walking. And have reported similar results for the low back, knee, and ankles and feet. So while the general media has talked about minimizing sedentary work, we also want to minimize any sustained standing posture. So that really encourages us to have a more variable approach where we're adding in movement throughout the day, but we do not yet have evidence on the optimal durations for the break periods and how often we should be switching back and forth. Now, another strategy for trying to add some variability is implementing anti-fatigue mats into the workplace. There is some research that supports lower levels of discomfort when using the anti-fatigue mats. However, the mats themselves are not a solution. They are part of this overall strategy towards fatigue intervention. And similarly, adding in worker education and looking at hiring appropriate workers for the job is an important component to or countermeasure to minimizing the risk of fatigue. But we don't really have any evidence on the specific effectiveness of these countermeasures. At the work level, right, we can then look at adding in rest breaks and varying the task to naturally add in some of that posture variability throughout the day. The benefit be to allow for the muscles and joints to have some periods of break so that we can recover or transfer the activity that's being done to multiple muscles across the day so that we are not overloading any one. And this can be done through work rest cycles where we have evidence to support short rest breaks that are spaced throughout the day, and we'll get to that in more detail on the next slide. You can also want to decrease the number of static or sustained loads that the person is required to support, because those sustained loads don't allow for the muscles to get any break, and we often cut off the oxygen supply and blood supply to the muscle that allows it to maintain the muscle force. And so we want to think about ways in which to reduce static loads by supporting the body segments. Most of the weight done at work, other than in maybe very heavy materials handling, is actually from supporting the weight of the body. So if you're holding a small hand tool, the tool itself maybe weighs 1 to 2 pounds, but if you have to hold that out in front of your body, your arm weighs about 5% of your body weight. So your shoulder has to support that arm weight plus the tool weight. So if we can add body segment supports like arm rests, then that can reduce some of that load. And then also add in tool supports so that the weight of any light tool or even heavier tools is taken off. Now, our traditional approach in a manufacturing environment to allocating rest allowances has been to look at a % of the total time and working that into the standard time allotted for the cycle. This has been used in very repetitive tasks where we have a fixed cycle time on maybe on the order of 2 to 5 minutes, and where we say maybe 5% is going to be a basic fatigue allowance. Now that, as I mentioned, requires a fixed task and fixed work cycles, which may not be present in a lot of workplaces. And it also fails to account for any task dependency or baseline conditions and any individual factors that may require different accommodations or allowances for different people. Now, the concern management often has in implementing rest breaks is that it's non-productive time for the workers, but fatigue symptoms have been shown to be reduced with the introduction of added short rest breaks, and that can then lead to improved productivity long term. And the rest break doesn't necessarily need to be an added period of break. So if we're adding in short rest breaks, these can be spaced as part of the cycle time, where you build a 2-minute cycle time to have maybe 15 or 20 seconds each cycle of rest so that the worker gets those short micro breaks. So some general rules of thumb is to, for high exertion tasks, lower the duration of the task and provide frequent breaks. For low exertion tasks, you get more benefit in terms of endurance and fatigue prevention by reducing the work intensity, because we have somewhat of an exponential curve where the endurance time greatly increases at those very low ends of the work intensity cycle. So how do we choose what are the best and most appropriate interventions that we want to implement? And we really have to start by understanding who the workers are. What are their characteristics in terms of their demographics? Do we have an older workforce that may be more susceptible to or have more difficulty doing high force tasks? What are the strength capabilities of our workers if we have that information from functional capacity evaluations? And what is the variability within the workforce? Do we have a good mix of male and female workers, or do we have more towards one? Do we have mostly older workers, or do we have a large range from 18 to 65? And we can look at our injury data and see from the injuries what type of injuries are occurring most often. So are they shoulder-based, back-based, distal upper extremity? And that can help us pinpoint what type of fatigue is present. And then we want to think about the tasks that are being performed for those who are becoming fatigued. So are they doing repetitive work, or is it forceful exertions? And this will let us focus our assessments and understand where we need to intervene. And then when I think about where in terms of the work environment, the environmental factors that may be contributing to the fatigue development. So if we have hot environments that or low light environments that may be contributing to it. And it may not all be in manufacturing shop floor workers that are experiencing the problems. It may be those in the office staff. And then we can think about the impacts of sedentary work for those individuals. Then we want to figure out which tools we can use in order to document the problems of fatigue that we're having and come up with any redesigns and how we're going to evaluate those redesigns. We want to choose appropriate tools that are going to provide us with the information and the data that we need to support our decision making. So as a first step, we want to talk to the workers, understand their tasks, understand the types of discomfort that they're having, and any feelings of fatigue that they might be experiencing. So this can be done with questionnaires or interviews, and we can talk across a range of employees, across the schedules, across the shifts, and across the workstations to understand what the range of symptoms might be. And we want to know when they're experiencing the symptoms. Is it at the start of a shift? Is it on a Friday afternoon? Is there any variability in what they're experiencing? This will allow us to understand that we do have a fatigue problem and identify and diagnose what type of problem it is, because we want to target the intervention to the specific type and location, as well as the root cause of that problem. Then we're going to gather some data on the tasks and on the worker responses, see to kind of balance out that subjective data that we have from talking to the workers. And this can be done by real-time observation of the operators to see if they're changing their behavior and whether they are adopting new strategies in order to compensate for any discomfort or feelings of fatigue. Or we can look at performance-based monitoring, where we're seeing if there are any reductions in task performance over the course of shifts or across weeks. These interventions are how we might target physical fatigue, and now Dr. Cassie Hilditch is going to talk about how we might target some of the shift and sleep related factors with fatigue.
Today I'm going to be talking to you about 2 case studies of implementing a sleep health program in different industries. And the first case study I'll take you through is in a series of fire departments across the US. And this study was conducted by researchers at the Division of Sleep Medicine at Harvard Medical School. So the sleep health program itself involved a 30-minute training session, which included videos from firefighters giving testimonials and management encouraging participation. The study included 8 fire departments, which then involved over 6,000 firefighters. And each of these fire departments were assigned to a different style of implementation for the training. So one of them was expert-led, and so these were sites where the experts from the research team would come to the station and deliver the training in person. Or there was train the trainer, where one of the research staff would train one of the firefighters or management on site, who would then deliver the training to other employees. Or there was an online method of training where the training was just a video that was available to the firefighters to watch whenever they were free. And so it's important to realize here that the type of method that was assigned to different stations was not random. So they were already assessing which of these methods would work best given the resources and the size of the different locations. So the study then assessed the knowledge of the firefighters with regard to sleep health by giving them a survey both before and then after their training. So they wanted to get a baseline and then assess if knowledge had improved with the intervention. Each training session was then followed by a voluntary sleep disorders screening program. So this involved a series of validated questionnaires that were used to screen for common sleep disorders such as obstructive sleep apnea, insomnia, and restless leg syndrome. And then finally, about a year later, This research team followed up with surveys and focus groups to evaluate whether there was any behavior change and whether there was retention of the knowledge that the firefighters had learned about sleep health and what the general attitudes towards the program were. Okay, so let's talk about the results. So you can see that the participation rate was lower in the online group, where it was relatively high at about over 80% in the expert-led and train-the-trainer group. And if we look at how much the knowledge improved, you can see that the expert-led group had a greater increase in knowledge retention after the intervention, whereas a little bit lower in the other groups, but there was at least some improvement in knowledge for all groups. And then this graph in the bottom right is showing how many participants sought clinical sleep evaluation after their sleep disorders screening. So you can see that the expert-led group had higher rates of following up on seeing a sleep clinician after their screening. And this may have been due to having an expert in the room that they could talk to about their sleep health or be able to use them as a resource as to how to follow up with this clinician. So with regard to changes induced by the training, we can see that roughly 40% of the participants changed their sleep behavior and that this made them feel less sleepy at work and that they got more sleep at home and felt like their general life had improved. And one of the participants quoted saying that knowing now that it is much more important, sleep is precious to me. So when they were asked about what types of behaviors they changed, they said that they tried to get more sleep, that they were more aware of their own fatigue levels, and that they were changing the way that they used caffeine so that they could use it more effectively. So in one station, the firefighters would only use half caffeine per coffee in order to use it more strategically. And this was something that they learned in the training. So from the focus group discussions at the end of the study, getting feedback from participants and just general observations of the research staff, the following elements of the sleep health program were identified as keys to success. And so it's really important that you make sure to have effective communication right from the start of trying to implement something like a sleep health program. And this is even before you roll it out. So engaging employees at developmental stages, and so this could be sending emails, but it's also important to sort of have those in-person communications, sort of safety group meetings or something like that. Again, right from the start, it's really important to involve unions and get management support for a program. So keeping them in early discussions and then demonstrating to the workers that that this program has support from unions and management. And this can be done by featuring them in the training video. So it's really important for the success of a program to identify a local champion. So someone not in management, but maybe a intermediary supervisory role who is respected by their peers and can help to inform people about why the study is happening. And they might be the main contact person, or they can give people the contact of one of the research staff if people have further questions about the study. And finally, it's really important to ensure the confidentiality and non-punitive nature of any study. So you want people to be responding honestly and not have any fear of ulterior motives from the management for collecting certain data about them. And so all of these things all relate to trust, which is essential for both ways between management and employees. It's also important that the training is evidence-based and is the information that you're providing is correct. So I strongly recommend consulting experts from either a university or a research consultancy to make sure that the information is correct. Because if you are delivering misinformation, then this could be worse than giving no information at all. And make sure you're choosing an implementation style that best fits your organization. So even though some of the results we showed today showed that the expert-led groups fared better on some of the outcome measures, this doesn't mean that it will work best for your organization. So there are a lot of pros and cons to all of those different implementation styles. So see which one fits best for you. And then tailoring the training that you deliver to your company or to your workers is really important. So making sure that the examples you use are relevant to them. And then finally, it's important to not only take a baseline measure before you put in an implementation, but then also follow up so that you can measure the success of the program or identify any problems or barriers. And then it's important to communicate these findings back to your employees who were involved in the study, because otherwise you might get less engagement in future surveys or different health promotion. Okay, so switching gears slightly to a sleep health program in aviation. So in this study, researchers not only implemented training, but they also changed a schedule. And this was performed by researchers across a domestic airline that included about 1,000 pilots. So for this study, they gave all pilots a 17-minute introductory video and again involved management and actual pilots in delivering this material to show that there was buy-in from these groups. They also gave a background survey, so that pre and post quiz for their pilots, and it was a pretty low response rate online quiz, but what it did show was that there was not a very good knowledge of sleep health that existed prior to the training. So this study also included a subgroup of 29 pilots that went into a more comprehensive training program, which involved 3.5 hours of training on a CD and then a change to one of their schedules. And during this change in schedules and training, their sleep, performance, and alertness strategies were assessed. So when we talk about the schedule that was changed in this long-haul airline, we're talking about a trip that was changed. A trip involves the outbound flight, any layover time, and then the return flight. And so they were assessing their sleep and performance both before, during, and after this trip. So in the top graph here, you can see the total sleep time for pilots that underwent the intervention in orange. And you can see clearly that they got a lot more sleep on their trip. So this was on the days that were involved in flying. And you can see that their sleep is a lot more stable from baseline to trip to recovery. Whereas when on the standard schedule and with no training, they had a lack of sleep during their critical flight days and then had to recover this sleep afterwards. And then when we look at performance, so this is looking at their reaction time speed, you can see again that the intervention led to greater performance during their trip, and that this was sustained across the study as well. So it seems like it was a pretty successful implementation. In addition, when they looked at the pre-post training quiz scores, the knowledge of sleep health increased sort of from a C grade average to an A+. There were no reported changes in the use of their alertness strategies. So if we think about the firefighters said that they changed their coffee use, but there wasn't any changes reported from this study. And it's important to realize that the impact of this intervention, while successful, we can't determine the relative contribution of the training versus the schedule change itself, because they were delivered at the same time. Also in this study, they also had a sleep health screening at the end of the training as well, but they weren't able to follow up as to how many people sought a clinician appointment afterwards due to medical privacy laws. So this is something to consider if you are looking to take these sort of measures. You need to be aware of your local laws. And it's also important to realize that changing schedules can be really hard to do, very logistically challenging. So often it is useful to model the changes that you would do first, and there are several biomathematical models that you can use to try to predict the amount of sleep and alertness that will result from changing schedules. And finally, just remembering the keys to success that were outlined in the previous case study.
Thank you, Mike, Lora, and Cassie for the great material. Now we will share some strategies to start managing fatigue in your companies. There is no one intervention or solution that's going to work in all cases. So, Mike, can you kick us off with that?
In closing with my summary, what I'd like to do is just highlight that we need to look beyond the flaws in the worker to find the flaws in the system. A lot of times we hide behind this notion of human error. And if somebody falls asleep while they're doing their job, or they're really tired and they make a mistake, we have to look beyond the mistake. We have to look beyond that action. Why did they take that shortcut? Why did they fall asleep? Maybe it's because they put in overtime. Maybe it's because a baby kept them awake all night. Maybe it's because the work schedule has them working during nighttime hours when they're going to be at higher risk to make a mistake. So we need to go beyond the flaws in the worker and find the flaws in the system in order to really mitigate the risk. We also need to start looking at our existing hazards, because fatigue in and of itself can be a hazard, but what I really want you to do is look at all the jobs you currently have and where there's already hazards and risks. If you add fatigue to the equation, how much more risk is being presented to that worker now? How much more is it being elevated? So we need to look at all of our hazards through that fatigue lens. And finally, we really need to start asking ourselves some tough questions. So when you have a worker who's tired and he's rubbing his eyes and he's slow moving and he's yawning and you know he has 4 more hours on shift in a safety sensitive position, what do you do? When that worker shows up tired to work, or when he's in the middle of a shift and he's got a critical task, what do you do? What policies do you have in place? What procedures can supervisors follow? Or is it really just everyone flying by the seat of their pants, which is what we typically find in a lot of the organizations right now? So we need to start asking some of those tough questions. Are we going to allow for napping? Are we going to have a rest and recovery period? Are we going to just dismiss this employee? It might be your best employee. Find out what are your available options and make the right choices. And thank you for your time.
So overall, the main takeaway message in terms of intervening with physical fatigue is to target the intervention to the source. So we want to focus on the work tasks that are performed and implement good ergonomics in those tasks to reduce the forces, reduce the repetitions, and reduce any of the awkward postures, because that's going to allow us to minimize fatigue development. We want to consider appropriate rest break allocations and variability in the postures, and choose the intervention that's going to be most appropriate for the type of fatigue and the location of discomfort that the workers are feeling. And then an important piece, once any intervention is put into place, is to go back and evaluate the effectiveness of that intervention. We often forget to close the loop and come back and see whether the strategies we've put in have been effective solutions.
So my final tips for today would just be to establish trust through good communication and a good safety culture. So it's important to keep all stakeholders involved and informed throughout the planning, implementation, and the delivery of results. So that means measuring baseline so that you can assess the change that your intervention has. And also measuring a baseline can help you identify fatigue hotspots so that you can really target your intervention once you know your fatigue risk. Then you deliver the intervention and then make sure that you're measuring the results to assess the success and also any potential barriers that come up. And then most importantly, you need to keep repeating this process because safety itself is a continuous process. Thank you.
Thank you, folks. The team at DORN works with multiple organizations to focus on employees' body, behaviors, and workplace environment. One of the key outcomes of our services is to drive an impact on fatigue. The strategies we recommend, in addition to what you heard from our other panelists, are hands-on manual therapy and self-care techniques, addressing the work environment from an ergonomic standpoint, and injury prevention programs, including looking at an industrial athlete program. And there's a link here to a webinar that we held a month ago on industrial athletes. The results that we see are improvement in sleep patterns of 33%. And you heard earlier the importance of getting enough rest. Medication reduction of 44%, along with improvements in productivity, morale, through employees taking ownership of their own healthcare. We hope you've enjoyed the presentations and discussions today. The goal of any program should be to empower your team to take personal ownership. To do so, this panel suggests you look to educate your employees on the importance of proper sleep, rest, and ways to address fatigue, and engage them with other company-sponsored solutions you've heard from our speakers today. It looks like we're out of time. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and a special thank you to our esteemed panel. If you've enjoyed today's webinar, watch for notification of future webinars, and as mentioned earlier, we will be hosting another one later this year with a senior manager at Tesla to specifically talk about how they're addressing fatigue. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. We will respond as quickly as possible to your questions and get back to you soon. This video will also be up on the DORN website in the next few days. I want to thank everybody for joining us today and have a beautiful day.